Philosophizing. I'm Nathan,
And I'm Ruby.
and Nadira is not here today.
But we are continuing the topic that we said we would from last week, which was aging in the brain,
Mhm.
right?
Or just aging in general, right?
Yeah,
Like we
or
were going to talk about the
aging
brain.
in general. Yeah, and so last week at the end of the stream, like the kind of prompt we came up with was like, how do you keep track of someone's chronological time from their biological time? Like or like their age, like the claim was this super rich person was like, I have unaged myself and went back in time, and I was of the camp that he has possibly slowed his growth, I guess, like slowed his aging process, but he hasn't like dialed it back. I think Nathan was in the camp that he has dialed some things back and some things not back, and we
Yeah,
wanted to like break
I
it apart,
guess.
right?
Yeah, I guess I was in the camp of kind of like, okay, I think it's possible to reverse aging, um, but I have some skepticism about whether he's actually measuring it correctly.
Oh, that's fair. Oh, also, I think you
Mhm.
were skeptical that throwing the kitchen sink at everything was like the
Yeah,
best
yeah, yeah.
mode too,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
So yeah, just like so for context, this guy's name is Brian Johnson, and he's some rich founder of something. Anyway, he decided that he was going to try and reverse aging in his body, and he kind of his approach is to kind of do a whole bunch of things. And yeah, I think that, but like, I think for safety reasons, that's not the best. But we can get into that later.
Yeah. But then we were talking about how like in most of our body we would like replace our cells in like cycles of 5 to 10 years, basically. Like 10 years ago, Ruby is literally a different Ruby because like each organ has like slowly replaced each cell. Do you know what I mean? Like it's the ship of Theseus situation, except the brain. And I was like, oh, your brain is like the time, like is a true, I guess, like trooper. It's like the heart of the ship of Theseus that was never replaced because neurons don't really proliferate. Like largely don't proliferate in the brain. It's the same like brain cells you had from childhood until now. Majority the same cell. Like if it was infected and glows with a fluorescent protein when you were a child, that same cell that glows with the fluorescent protein is there now.
Mhm.
Like that's what I was thinking. Um, and then I was like, okay, like let's do some reading, and I briefly went into a rabbit hole, and I found this paper which Nathan's gonna drop in the chat, and it's about how they created a metric. So scientists have actually created a metric to compare your true chronological age to like what your, you know, brain age actually is. And the way they did it is they used machine learning on large data sets of fMRI brains. So they basically put a lot of people through scanners, and these are probably people that they put through scanners for other reasons, but they just had several banks, like thousands of people worth of data, and they have their true age, and they screened out all the people with any diseases. So it's just like regular Joes and Janes that went into an fMRI scanner, and they just like, you know, scanned their brains and also had a real chronological age. So this is like their age that's written on their um, uh, whatever,
Birth
like their
certificate.
charts.
Yeah.
Yeah, their birth certificate, whatever. So matched with like brains, and so they trained a large. They trained it, the algorithm to recognize the age, and then they took new subjects like people of interest that we're interested in. So for example, you could probably put our favorite uh, example, the dude that thought he changed his body backwards. So you could take a scan of his brain, and then you could use the information from the algorithm to predict what brain age he would be according to like the large populace. And then you could take the difference between your actual birth certificate age and your age according to this prediction, and then that would be your PDA, and then that is a metric they can use to like compare how healthy your brain is. And the nice thing about it is like on top of that, with these subjects, they also did like cognitive tests, and so then they like showed that higher PDA scores would have better cognitive scores, which means that when there's a bigger difference between your cognitive skills, between your predicted age, which means like it thought you were younger than you actually were, um, uh, you did better cognitively on the cognitive test, which kind of like validates the predicting of your brain age. So that was kind of cool. I was just like, oh, like look at that. Someone thought about this and they came up with a way to study it, like a new way to test it. And then they like went through a lot of scans to train this algorithm to like recognize, approximate age of anyone. So you can like plug it in. Yeah, of the brain.
And
That's
so
kinda
what
cool.
this is looking at is it looking at like the size of different regions or the thickness of the cortex or like what?
Yeah, they trained it on like 4 different metrics, and it was like white matter to like amount of white matter, amount of like there's a bunch of like things they looked at. So let's see what the 4 ones are. Okay, intracranial volume. No. They were adjusted for an intracranial volume. So it's let me find metrics. Metric. I need to quickly skim through this paper to find what the things that they used to train it, right? Like, or like what are the metrics from the scan that they used to demonstrate the trained on MRIs to predict age, weighted image. Okay, so the input data included sex, the MRI scanner, and it literally was a Jacobian map, white and gray matter segmented images. That was the materials they put into it.
So kind of this machine learning model just kind of has access to just like a map that is showing like it's just kind of giving it a map of like, okay, where's all the white matter and where's all the gray matter in the brain, and then
Correct.
the machine learning learns to predict what predicts age from that.
Yeah, and it starts with like the raw images or Jacobian maps, and they just fed thousands of it to it. Like the banks were from Iceland, the UK, and like one other country, but there were like thousands of MRIs. Like obviously this is like a big data like problem, right? Like each one of these scans are probably quite massive. And then they had to screen through each chart to make sure that the person has never experienced traumatic injury. They don't have any like mental disorders. They don't have any like heart problems. Like these are all like healthy adults,
Like healthy people.
healthy people across a range, right? Like they also like old
Mhm.
people and young people, but they all had to be healthy. So like that almost, I have to say like that biases the training model, because like now it's only like healthy brains. And like that's assuming like if you're gonna try and compare, like if you have any neurodivergence of any kind, like they took out people with schizophrenic, they took out people that were autistic, they took out or have autism, they like took out any neurodivergence. They were just like healthy people, male and female, and that was it.
I do think like for aging studies that is a good idea. Kind of if you're trying to get at like if they're I mean and kind of like we can talk about this, so kind of like I think of aging as kind of like a disease or a collection of diseases, which I think is like not everyone agrees with. But I think if you think about it that way, kind of like I think a big confound when you do these studies is kind of like you have aging itself as kind of a disease or a process, but then you also just have kind of like other age associated diseases. So like you do want to like I do think it's important to clarify like, okay, are we looking at like the brains of people who have like hypertension, and kind of like it's possible that kind of then your signature of what you think is age is really actually a signature of like hypertension, which increases with age, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Okay, I suppose it really depends. Like, this is one of the instances where it's really important. Oh, I guess this one is not an instance where it's important to look at how they picked the samples, because you really like that makes sense. Like, you want to clean like control, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, like I was surprised how
It's kind of
accurate it was.
interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
like then it. I mean, then kind of like the downside is like if you have ADHD or whatever, like it just might not work for you at all. So,
Yeah, well, like if you look at like traditional fMRI like studies, I wish Nadira was here because she could tell us. But like a lot of times they'll like exclude people who are like left-handed because they're just like, yeah, like they used the wrong dominant limb. So like because there's a
I
higher probability like your like things could be swapped, like it's a
yeah.
50-50 chance for people who are left-handed, for their like verbal centers to be like not on the same side as everyone else, and to clean the data they just like throw it out, right? Like they just
Yeah. With
truncate.
EEG studies, like we do that too. Like I work with a lot of people who do that, and honestly, I think it's bullshit. Like it's like
You're like,
it
just because you're
doesn't
left-handed you're throwing them out, what?
right. It's like, okay, so like it just doesn't actually clean your data that much. It's just like so the issue is about 90% of right people have their language system on the right side of their brain, but only about 60% of left-handed people have language on the right side of their brain. So they're like, okay, the left-handed people are more variable. But it's like brains are variable in a lot more ways than that. And it's like unless you are doing a study that particular like where you need to like know the exact location of where the person's like language processing is, in which case you're actually going to do a localizer and you're actually going to make them do a task and like find their language center, like
In which case it also doesn't matter because you went and
yeah.
found it.
Yeah.
uh,
It's just like it's honestly just like a very weird superstition that neuroscientists have. That like it's like bad luck to run left-handed people in your study or something.
Yeah, and like
Um,
sometimes you know, like you're like, oh, haha, it's just like a small portion of people. But if you look at like the sample sizes people pick or scientists have picked historically, they're also like, let's not use any females because they have an estrous cycle, like female animals. They're like they have an estrous cycle. Like that's weird and variable. It's gonna throw off our data. It's gonna make no sense. Let's just like not use them at all and just use males for all our behavior studies. And then you're like, oh wait, are we just studying like male mice behavior and not anything else? Do you know what I mean? Like these are biases that we, as the experimenter, introduced.
yeah,
It's not
and like
even a variable. Yeah.
I mean also like I point out like it doesn't like it also doesn't clean your data that much. I mean like in humans, for example, males have differing levels of testosterone depending on the time of day that you measure them, and it's like presumably that affects various biological responses. So like why like if you're using just males, that's not even necessarily making your data less variable.
Yeah. Um,
um anyway. But
yeah.
anyway, okay. So we were talking about kind of this calculating the brain age, right?
Yeah, calculating the brain age. And then this is also calculating what they call the PDA, which is the
Mhm.
predicted age difference. And the idea is that the larger the difference between your predicted age, I guess it would be bad if it's large the other direction too. So large difference, as in the difference is towards younger. Like if your predicted age is younger, is correlated with higher cognitive abilities or like less bad at scoring cognitive tests, and having higher scores, or sorry, having lower PDA scores, which is like closest to your actual age, and also going the other direction, which means your brain rated as older than your actual chronological age, is correlated with doing poorly or less well at the cognitive tests, which does align. But not it wasn't crazy. Like I didn't plot it out, but I was looking at the tables and I was like, it's correlated, but it's not like it's not like blow your mind perfect correlation. It's just kind of like slightly trending in that direction. Like I wouldn't be like like I think your brain kind of just works pretty well across. I think okay. The other thing is like cognitive tests are kind of variable and like it's a poor. It's like an okay test when it's like really extreme cognitive deficits. I think it's like in like healthy people, like we're all gonna ace the exams.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that would kind of be my question about it, though, is like beyond kind of cognitive function, kind of if your brain age is higher than, like, if you have an unusually high brain age compared to your chronological age, does that mean that you're like at higher risk for dementia or you're more likely to develop like early onset dementia? Because, like, to me, that is like a better validation that it's really measuring biological age than kind of just like if it's like a test that kind of like people are naturally kind of distributed on, I'm just like, okay, you made like an intelligence test that just uses like MRI. But if it's picking out the people who score really badly on like an Alzheimer's diagnostic test, and those are like the people who are actually going on to develop dementia, then I'd be more convinced that like this is like a measurement of biological age of the brain.
Oh, that's actually a great idea. I'm sure this is something a kind of analysis that is being done. Like
Yeah.
I feel like we to train the model we took out all the diseased brains, right? But like what if we tested the diseased brains like with the model to match the score, right? Like would an Alzheimer brain age get a predicted age that was older, right? Like that
Yeah,
would be
or
a
just
great way to test it.
or follow longitudinally, because kind of like
Yeah.
if you're thinking about like, okay, it's just like age, it's a thing that kind of accumulates. Then like we test a bunch of middle-aged adults, and some of them have really high brain age, and then kind of you'd predict that those are the ones who are most likely to develop like early onset Alzheimer's in the next like 10 years or so.
Yeah. So I actually
Um,
So,
so go ahead.
do you remember when we used to work at the Institute of Aging back in the day?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
they have a longitudinal study where they fMRI the same population of humans for like a long time, like since they were in 30s, and then they followed them into their older age. So I think it's been going for like 30 plus years. And so the idea is that you could follow the age, like you could take the fMRIs from each one of their sittings and see if they're chronologically aging at the same rate with their brains, and then you can also find out if they eventually got dementia, and you can like group them into two, like post, you know what I mean, like afterwards, and you could like retrospectively see if like it was matching time, like chronological time, like biological time, chronological time was like this, or if it was like one group where like the age was going faster than the, do you know what I mean? Like that would be a cool analysis to do. I don't know if that exists. This is something we should look for, but yeah, that would be a really cool way to analyze data. But this is actually a fairly recent paper, so this analysis that they did with all these brains, so it might not be super available yet, which I think is one of the failures of neuroscience, is that like once people publish this paper and it's like, cool, we did this one thing, and then like you read the paper and you're like, I wish I had my hands on that exact algorithm and I could plug in, you know, my data to see it, which I don't think is super common. Like it's starting to happen. Like there's one for a mice that just dropped yesterday where you could like download all the sequencing data that they did. The Allen Brain Atlas just dropped one, and it had one for like the aging brain too. And so you could like literally upload your data and compare to like the entire, they mapped like every single brain region in a mouse brain. And so you could like drop your data in and see how it matches up with their like standard brain, which is really cool, right? Because like that's the kind of like comparison that would tell you a lot of things. You can like data mine like this resource. Like it's actually a useful library, which is not always the way papers get published. No,
I was gonna say, so with this question about disease, disease kind of, does this predict your risk of disease? I was actually looking into it, And so I actually found an interesting paper suggesting it did. And this is actually not about this brain marker. So I think one of the things that's important to point out is so kind of what this brain, this PAD, this predicted age difference through the brain, it's one kind of what kind of aging researchers call, oh, something is making a lot of noise.
Sorry,
Um,
that's my snacks.
So this PAD is like kind of one example of something that researchers call it's still quite noisy, a biological clock, which is like essentially just like something that correlates with age, and you can calculate a difference between the chronological age and the biological age. Um, anyway, so there's other metrics that are used for this. I think the most common are like we talked about last time are based on DNA.
Yeah,
But you can
like
even look
length
at
of
things like
telomeres, right?
actually mostly so telomeres aren't used that much for some reason. So the most common ones are actually looking at methylation of DNA.
Oh, yeah. Oh, but that's correlated with like how much radiation you've had, right?
But it's also just correlated with age. So let's see. Yeah. Oh yeah. It's called an epigenetic clock. Hang on, let me pull it
Ah,
up. Um,
yeah. Oh,
yeah.
trust.
Yeah. So there's a couple of different epigenetic clocks. Kind of the first and the most famous is this Horvath and Raj clock, and essentially by kind of so you can do kind of tests that just look at the expression levels of basically all the genes in a particular tissue, and interestingly this correlates really well with people's biological age. So kind of the first one they looked at 353 kind of sites in the genome, and they basically measured how methylated it is. So it's basically, does DNA have these specific regulatory chemicals attached to it? Um, and it turns out that you can actually usually predict people's age within about 3.6 years from this. Um, but kind of if people are like on either side of that. So the thought is that kind of if your biological age is a lot older than your chronological age, maybe you're more likely to develop diseases than other people your age. And interestingly, there actually is some evidence for this that I found. So they were looking at some of these clocks. They looked at genetic ones and also ones that were just based on kind of other biological measures. And what they found is that the people who had the highest biological age were more likely to develop neurological disease like dementia and stroke.
Yeah.
So that kind of suggests that this really is like tracking aging. Like it really is a valid measure.
Oh yeah. Okay. So I'm also finding this the study in 2019 where they had like 9 people. This is like a really small study, but they basically gave them growth hormones and
Huh.
like diabetes medication for like a year. And allegedly their epigenetic clock went back by 2 years,
Mhm.
like 2.5 years, which is kind of
What
exciting.
what medicine was it? Was it metformin?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It just
Okay.
says 2 diabetes medication and the growth hormone. But it was also selectively turning back the clock on certain tissues. So like it thymus glands and immune function. And I'm thinking it's because like these are glands that people are willing to like get a biopsy from.
Uh-huh. Oh yeah,
Like
definitely.
any other tissues. But they probably did other tissues too, and like muscle and whatever, and it like didn't change. So like
Yeah.
it's like a targeted like certain organs, like this kind of worked. But it is still quite exciting that it changed their
Yeah.
epigenetic clocks in those cells, right? Like that is kind of cool. Like we can, and it makes sense. Like you were talking about, like Yamanaka factors. Like we use those to, like take cells back to like into stem cells. Like we get them, like we get cells that are already like skin cells, and we make them back to a before they have decided what they are cell, and then you can like change it forward to something else. And essentially, that kind of is turning back the clock of a cell, right? Like we went back to a state of before it has decided what that cell is going to become, and
Yeah.
now we're telling it to grow into something else, right? Like we turn it back and turn it forward, which is kind of cool. Like I guess like in the era of 2023, we don't really appreciate that that's turning back the time.
Yeah.
But because that's such a like a normal assay to do in cell culture, but like technically in cell culture, you are turning back the clock.
Yeah. And I do think it's kind of interesting. So it's like there's this view of aging that kind of aging is like kind of accumulated damage, right?
Yeah.
And I think the interesting thing is that there has to be some way to kind of reset that accumulated damage, or you wouldn't be able to continue producing new humans. Like so the thought is that kind of like in gamete cells there's something that happens, and it's probably a big part of it is this kind of epigenetic resetting. So actually I think you make a strong case that kind of like what the reason that kind of like babies aren't born aged is because these cells kind of undergo this epigenetic reset, and they get reset to this pluripotent state, and it essentially erases a lot of the effects of aging on them. And so from that perspective, then I think it's kind of interesting that it kind of makes sense that if you induce this epigenetic reset in other kinds of cells, in cells just in your body, which is, so we were talking about Yamanaka factors. These are chemicals that cause cells to revert back from being their normal function to just kind of revert into stem cells that are kind of generic cells that can become anything. So when you give an organism Yamanaka factors, some of its cells actually kind of revert into this sort of primordial form that would be seen in like an embryo. And interestingly, there's some evidence that this can slow down or reverse some of the signs of aging.
Okay, my other thought, because you said it's like methylation, like it's an epigenetic thing. This is like caused by literally exposure to your environment. So like, what if you just lived in a bubble, like a lead-lined bubble, so you don't get any sun radiation, like you didn't get, do you know what I mean? Like, what if you lived in a bubble and like you were fed healthy foods and like you're shielded from radiation? Like would you age slower because you had less methylation? Do you know what I mean? Like those methylated markers would be reduced, or does that just artificially boost your scores on the methylation count and doesn't actually change how well your body functions? Do you know what I mean? Like biologically, it's just artificially boosting your scores.
This has been a whole debate actually about kind of like how much of aging is kind of like a pre-programmed program. Like how many of these things will just continue, like will just kind of happen at a set rate versus how many are really related to environmental conditions.
Yeah.
I think it's
what do you think the split is? What do you think the split is to you? Like environmental to like preset clock. Like I'm sure it's something in between, but like I wonder how much, like, is it 50-50, like 60-40, like 70-30, like, you know, like which way would it lean?
I mean, okay, so I think one of the things that's really makes this really hard is that we have to breathe oxygen to stay alive. And that is actually one of the things that is the most damaging to us. It's at least kind of it's one of the theories. So kind of one of the things that's kind of been talked about a lot in aging is the concept of kind of reactive oxygen species. And essentially the problem is that we rust. So oxygen can form ions that then bind to other biological chemicals and damage them. They essentially rust them. And that includes parts of our DNA. And it seems like actually our bodies have a lot of defensive systems to basically kind of protect and repair the damage induced by oxygen. But it seems like we just kind of accumulate a lot of damage just over time from the fact that we have to breathe oxygen.
Yeah, I think that's like the whole like idea behind consuming foods that are like antioxidant foods is
Mhm.
because it's like gonna help that process along, right?
Yeah.
It's gonna help our body like fix the rust, I guess. Like the
Yeah.
layman's version of like, hey, let's like boost that process along. But like yeah, there's a lot of things like I talked about radiation earlier, right? Like for example,
Mhm.
UV radiation, like our just being under the sun, like our body has natural mechanisms to like repair sun damage. um it
Mhm.
takes a lot of work, and if it is overdriven, like bad things happen, right? Like you end
Yeah.
up with
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
skin cancer. If it's doing its job correctly, like if you don't overdo it, like we have some protection built in our systems to handle some amount of damage from oxidation and radiation and like repair, because it's like it's really bad to get like this kind of damage can like cause mutations, right? Like
Mhm.
that's bad.
Yeah. And I think this is actually really fascinating when it comes to like that brings up this really interesting concept when it comes to antioxidants, because I think kind of like a couple of decades ago there was this idea, so we're like, okay, this oxygen reactive oxygen causes damage. So if you take a lot of antioxidants, you can neutralize the reactive oxygen and you should slow down aging. And essentially none of the studies that were done actually showed that worked. In one case, they actually gave antioxidants, vitamin E, to smokers, people who were at high risk of lung cancer, and they found that it actually caused them to have more lung cancer. Um,
Oh no.
yeah, um, and I
Does
think
it help to breathe less? Like like
like
what actually works? Should we be like meditating and not running around as much? Like would that
so there is a
reduce
theory about that.
oxidation?
Yeah, kind of the what people actually think now is that giving high levels of exogenous antioxidants actually just kind of messes you up. So like any beneficial effects it has, like it are kind of counterbalanced by the fact that it messes up different regulatory systems in your body. Sometimes it might kind of
Oh.
so sometimes it might actually kind of suppress your body from making some of the antioxidants that it needs. Like so kind of it might prevent your body from making natural antioxidants that are actually more effective in some cases, and it also prevents your body from using oxidation as signaling. And it turns out that's important for the immune system. We actually use reactive oxygen species to kill cancer cells, which is probably why those people got more cancer. It also seems to attenuate some of the effects of exercise. It seems like that increase in reactive oxygen species is actually part of the signal that kind of tells your body to get stronger after exercise. And so if you block it with a ton of antioxidants, that no longer happens. And
Oh no.
interestingly, one of the most effective things that you can do for your health is to eat a plant-based diet. And a lot of the some of the antioxidants in plants that make that healthy are actually oxidants. And the reason they have an antioxidant effect is primarily because they're weak oxidants, but they really stimulate your body to ramp up its own production of natural antioxidants.
That makes so much sense. I
Yeah.
think we're just a sack of bones
Mhm.
and water, and we need to like get homeostasis.
Yeah.
And that makes so much sense. Like if you inundate a system with something, like then it becomes dependent on it, and then like it
Right.
gets fucked.
Or even just like
Like the
even just
natural system gets fucked. Yeah.
yeah, or even just like, okay, this idea of kind of react like it turns out like oxidation really probably plays a role in like every organ we have. So kind of if you just like completely knock it out by giving massive doses of these chemicals, just kind of you're gonna mess up a lot of signaling systems. Versus if you give something that maybe kind of increases your capacity to deal with it when it's a problem, like some of these antioxidants are probably like exercise does this too, then kind of you can get health benefits.
Ah,
um, you also were
that's
asking about
cool.
kind of like, okay, can we breathe less air?
Yeah, can we
um,
just like breathe air, like or like breathe less oxygen? Like I know like people who live in like higher altitude are just like constantly slightly breathing less oxygen. Does that make them like have less oxidative stress? Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah, so I
like
believe,
do they
let me look
experience
this up. I believe people who live at high altitude actually do live longer. Um, yeah,
what? Should we be moving into the mountains now?
yeah,
Like
which is
how
kind of
much longer?
interesting because
Like 2 years longer?
they're also getting more radiation. But okay, so this says so men lived on average the high altitude men lived on average 1.2 to 3.6 years longer, and women half to 2.5 years longer.
Okay. So
Oh
we
wait,
should like live on the top of a mountain with a lead
oh
box, is
wait,
what
but
I'm
it says,
hearing.
okay, when results were adjusted for other factors, there is no significant difference between.
Nah.
But okay, hmm.
That's not as promising.
Yeah.
I think
Let's
it's too
let
variable.
me
There's
look
too
at
many. It's too hard to control this experiment. Like, like how long do they have to live in
yeah.
altitude for
Here's
to
a
see
so
this
this is
effect?
interesting, yeah. So like here's a review paper on it. Um, um okay, effects of living at high altitudes on mortality. So it's inconsistent due to complex interactions, but residency at higher altitudes is associated with lower mortality from cardiovascular diseases, stroke, and certain kinds of cancer. But people are more likely to die from COPD and infections. So, I guess hard to say.
No, like they could die from some other reason.
Yeah. But so the one thing I was going to bring up with that is so like it's hard to breathe less air. But one thing that has been talked about, and this was one of the very first interventions, anti-aging interventions, is actually called calorie restriction, which is it's like literally just like eating very little food. And one of the theories about this at first actually was that it slows down the metabolic rate, so you're producing less reactive oxygen species. Because for metabolism, the air to produce the oxygen has to actually react with food. So if you're eating less food, you kind of limit the amount of that can be produced. Now, I don't think that's actually necessarily true, and that's because kind of I don't think that's so calorie restriction does seem to slow down aging in a lot of species, but I don't think it's necessarily because it slows down metabolism. And the reason for that is that there's also something that's very popular right now called intermittent fasting, which is where you eat a normal amount of calories, but you only eat them in big bursts. So you'll like eat a ton of food one day and no food the next day. And this also seems to basically have the same effects as calorie restriction. So kind of if it was working because it slowed down metabolism, then intermittent fasting shouldn't really work. And the thought actually is that so the more modern model is that kind of this calorie restriction or fasting actually kind of induces a stress response, and a lot like some of those kind of natural antioxidants that I talked about. What that does is that it causes the body to produce a lot of kind of defensive chemicals. So it upregulates its antioxidant systems. It upregulates some chemicals that protect against cancer. Just it's kind of a stress response, and that in turn kind of slows down aging because it's also protecting against some of these environmental factors that are causing aging, like these reactive oxygen species.
Huh. Now I'm just trying to decide, should I be like on a diet? Like should I be intermittent fasting? like
I
would
mean,
that
I'm a
help?
fan.
You're a fan.
Yeah,
I forget who was telling us that they were like accidentally intermittent fasting
Francis.
because they just forgot. Yeah,
Yeah,
Francis.
she was
It's
like,
like
I do
forgot to eat.
intermittent fasting, which is just so you forget
Um,
to eat. Um,
yeah, I wonder if that is enough, right? Like the disruptiveness of intermittent fasting. Is it like the disruptive? Because like at the end of the day, you're consuming the same net calories, right?
Mhm.
Like if you took like a month where you intermittent fasted and you calculated how many calories you consumed, by the end of the month it would be the same as if someone just had three
Uh-huh.
square meals a
Yeah,
day, right? That's the
right.
idea.
Yeah. There's actually studies that intermittent fasting is pretty ineffective for losing weight. It's no more effective at losing weight than like any other diet where you eat the same amount of calories. So it's like it's not
Yeah.
really reducing your calorie intake.
Yeah, it's more for like I guess like stressing out your body in a way
Uh-huh.
that
Yep.
makes it
Mhm.
like more likely to do well for a longer
Right.
amount of time.
Yeah, and
Okay, I can.
interestingly, there are some studies now in humans showing that when people do this, it does seem to improve some biomarkers of kind of metabolic health, even though they're eating the same number of calories.
I can see this being like anthropologically kind of our niche though. I feel like this is actually the
Mhm,
healthy like the way our bodies were designed to do the thing because
mhm.
I'm just thinking of like humans as like hunter gathering species,
Yeah,
which is like our OG niche, and I think sometimes you just like there's a shit ton of berries, so you just gorge on the berries,
yeah,
and then some days you just go hungry because like there was no food, you couldn't find it, and then there's another day where you like killed a bison and you're like, oh shit, like let's eat a lot of meat right now,
yeah,
and then at the end of the month you had enough calories to survive and
yeah.
maintain your weight, like you did good. I can see that being like the natural, not natural, but like that was like our anthropologically like just like the human like that's our homeostasis of our species, like that kind of makes sense. um as opposed to this like regimented 3 meals a day kind of exact same amount of calories every day. I can see that not being as natural, I guess. But
Mhm.
then again,
Yeah,
like we live in the modern world with like the grains and stuff, which is like so
yeah,
like the agrarian, like the whole farming and stuff really changed everything. So
right,
we also lived through thousands of years of that. So
right. Like we're
who
partially
knows?
adapted to like agriculture, like so.
Yeah, we are also adapted to agriculture and more slightly sedentary things. Like we like drinking alcohol and we like bread and rice and grains. Like we definitely populated the planet more because of farming, right? Like the population wise, that sometimes, okay, this is like a complete side note, but that's kind of freaks me out sometimes because you realize that before the population boom, like there's a lot fewer beings on this planet. And that means like we're a lot more related to each other than we thought, because like every time there was like a bottleneck in population, you end up with like a certain number of humans, and we're related to one of those certain number of humans, and at some point it was not that many of them, like the approximate population of like a medium-sized country was the entire population of the planet. um like we're all do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
isn't that slightly freaky?
I guess. Yeah,
um
yeah. Like the world
we
was
should
just like
maybe,
Iceland. Yeah.
yeah, like the world was just Iceland, and that was it. Like, and then like everyone since then, like the whole world, all the humans on this planet now are related in some way to one of the Icelandic population. Like obviously spread out across the whole planet and all, whatever, like migration and stuff, but still like genetically we are related to a small number of humans. And yeah, I find sometimes I think about genealogy a lot. It's quite interesting from like a genetics perspective. It's quite interesting, and seeing like pressures. So last week we talked about the pressures of pandemic
Mhm.
and how it like changed. Like every time there's a huge pandemic or like huge catastrophe where like a large population dies off, like it shifts the entire available genome, like available genetic diversity has shifted and favors a particular population. Like I wonder like what shift happened with COVID, right? Like what new diseases are going to arise in future because we certain populations survived
Mhm.
the
Hmm.
pandemic
Yeah.
so well.
Yeah.
Dark thoughts
Yeah.
for the future.
I mean, I wonder, like, I mean, or conversely, it could lead, like, it could reduce the rates of some diseases because people survived, right? Like,
Yeah, that's true. We also live longer now in general. Like our entire species lives longer than our predecessors did.
Like one thing.
Like
Yeah. Go ahead.
no, like it like just it was just like an aging thing, right?
Yeah.
Like we like every generation is longer. Like we spend longer in like each generation is longer, a little bit longer than the previous generation. Like they have longer lives. Like and that's not just like small numbers too. Like I feel like in the 30s, like good luck making it to your 60s, right? And now it's like you're kind of expected to make it into your 60s. like it, like you're not an elder anymore when you hit 60.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you're not even getting retirement until you're 65. At least in the States, right? Like you're not an elder yet. You're not 65. And I think they're gonna keep bumping that number because like 65 people are like spry and young. I would argue that
I mean,
like
that's
we're
been
kind
happening
of like
in France, right? Like that was kind of the whole, or part of the cause of the protests there. Was the
yeah, they're like you're not old enough to be retired.
Yeah.
And I was just like, well, is it because you're biologically not as battered and invalid by the time you're 65? Like, have we actually as a species like de-aged generally because we live longer? Do you know what I mean?
think that
Like,
is actually not true. So I
you
think,
don't think that's true?
yeah, no, I was reading a study around about this. Let me pull it up. Oh yeah, so I mean, so at least kind of when it comes to cognition, that's not true. So kind of we are
like the cognitive decline period is longer because we live longer now.
so okay, so let me look at this. So it's like, so it says baby boomers face greater cognitive decline than previous generations. And so essentially, okay, so it is, so essentially what it's looking at people over 50 and it's doing cognitive tests. And so kind of the thought is that kind of, and then so over time, kind of the cognitive score of these kind of older adults has increased with successive generations. But in baby boomers, it is actually seems to be lower in this group than kind of historically people over 50 were. And so they kind of interpret this as like maybe this group of people is experiencing faster cognitive decline than was happening before.
But this actually correlates. Remember when we were looking at the data for like, are we getting stupider?
Mm-hmm.
Remember when we were looking at the data for like, are we as a species getting stupider? And we're looking at like high school grades. And they also plateaued and then started trending down. In the past like, also like the past 10 years.
Yeah.
And that was quite shocking too, right? Like, what if it's just because this older generation is also exposed to like cell phones?
Yeah, it could be.
Because wasn't that like what we thought? Like they're like, hey, they're just scoring more poorly on these cognitive
I
exams.
think it would be more convincing if you had longitudinal data that kind of showed that kind of like this generation was actually like, because this is just looking at raw scores. I think it would be more convincing if you actually could show at a longitudinal level, so the same person measuring multiple times, that like you actually had higher rates of decline.
Yeah, I do think these longitudinal studies are the kind of the way to go. Like they're smaller sample sizes, but you can like really mine it for longer.
Yep.
It's slightly destructive for like real life because they have to go every year, right? Like they have to get like a health check every year and like submit their data and like sit in the scanner and do all these.
Are you in the
tests.
Are you in the All of Us study?
The All of Us study. I am not in the All of Us study. What is the All of Us study?
So that is a big longitudinal study that's being done by the National Institutes of Health. And because you mentioned that kind of a small sample size, and I think this is actually one of the attempts to address that, it's basically just they're doing a huge longitudinal study of the U.S. population.
How do I not know about this?
I don't know. Like when I was like at NIH, they tried to like recruit me for it a lot.
Yeah, they did not try to recruit me.
Weird.
Or I just ignored the emails. It could be one or the
Yeah.
other. Yeah, like no, I was not. Are you do you participate in it? Like what do they ask of you?
Yeah, so they have a bunch of questionnaires about your health. They have you go into, so you, if you live near a clinic that participates in it, which there's a bunch all over the US, kind of you go into it and they'll do some physical, like kind of basic physical measurements like blood pressure, that sort of thing. And then actually optionally you can actually submit like a DNA sample, and then kind of they will look at that and look at how that predicts changes. Also, interestingly, at some point they haven't done it yet, but at some point you will actually be able to get sequence DNA data from it too, that you can look at.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, no, the only thing I ever signed up for was like bethematch.org.
Mhm.
So I am technically a bone donor for someone if they
If
miraculously
they need it, yeah.
have, yeah, if they ever need markers. Because I think it's really difficult to find, and it's also like hard to find, especially hard if you're like a minority. Like, you have like my genes. So like if it's useful, like, you know, you never know. I think it's good karma. Like heck, like maybe someday I'd need it, right? So but this is cool too. Like I didn't know about it. And
There's also an
and this
equivalent.
clearly addresses. Yeah,
Yeah. There's
go ahead.
also something similar in the UK called the UK Biobank, which has been already like a huge boom for research.
Yeah. So the UK Biobank actually is extra fascinating because all of I guess like for many years all of the men in the UK had to serve the army, and as part of serving the army you have to donate blood. Not donate blood, but like you have to get a physical done and like donate blood. So they have like these really nice snapshots of like basically all the men of a certain age that like served in the war, and they have it like longitudinally, like for the 4 years or
Yeah.
8 years or however long they served, and then they continued that throughout their now, like they continue collecting for anyone that's in the service, and it's just a biobank that is available for researchers across the. Yeah, it's kind of cool because it's like, oh, this is government funding, and you know, if you're a government thing and you're just like studying humans for like the sake of humans, like you can get access to uh, banked data or banked samples even. So it's kind of cool. You can like literally get vials of blood. From
Yeah.
like if you choose to jump through all the hoops, you can.
That is
Yeah,
exactly
there
what
it
I
is.
wanted for Christmas. That's
It's like, please give me these things of blood, and I want to compare like 18-year-old me versus like 30-year-old me
you
versus
just
like
like, you can even
60-year-old
get
me.
vials of blood. Like, cool.
Yeah, yeah, they take vials. They were just in a freezer somewhere. It's literally a bank, so that's kind of cool. I feel like that's kind of like a light way to end. This is a good place, like a good, light-hearted, positive science. Go volunteer, um, for all of us research, or you know, be a donor.
Yeah.
um, yeah, cool. We didn't have as many questions this time, so I guess like we ran through our topics.
Yep.
Do you have anything else you want to talk about, Nate?
I did. There was one thing that I like briefly wanted to talk about.
Oh yeah, let's do
Yeah.
it.
So one time, one thing that we were talking about last time was this question of like, okay, can you actually reverse aging or just slow it down? And I think one of the best kind of cases that I think that demonstrates that you actually can reverse aging is this particular kind of experiment that has been done with a chemical called NAD+, which stands for nicotinamide adenine. Actually, I'm not gonna try and. It's called NAD+. Anyway, the interesting and one of the interesting thing about it is its levels decline in cells in age, and it produces this state called pseudohypoxia, which basically means that if the levels get too low, it interferes with the function of the mitochondria. They don't work as well. They actually kind of resemble what happens when the cells are being starved of oxygen. And the interesting thing is there's been some studies in mice that have shown that if you take old mice that have low levels of this chemical and you just give them more of this NAD+, it increases the levels in the cells. And interestingly, it can actually improve the function of the muscles and kind of boost them up to the level in young mice. And so the thought is that kind of like in the old mice, you have degeneration and kind of poor function in the muscles because their mitochondria are not working well. They can't get energy, so they don't function very well, and also the cells just start to kind of die. But it's a reversible thing, and if you give them more of this particular chemical, then you can essentially reverse that age-related damage that's happened.
Oh, that's cool. Did they like inject it into the muscle or like systemically?
I think
Like,
you give it systemically, usually.
oh, that's cool. And also, I just looked up NAD+. It's not that weird. It's nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't that hard.
Okay, fine.
um, cool. Oh wow, there's like as soon as you look it up, like the first Google thing is like, can I take it every day?
Yeah. Yeah, so people actually take this, and I think like so this is a supplement that people actually take now, and I think people usually take it wrong. It's interesting. You see a lot of kind of like young people taking it to prevent aging, which is not really what it does. I mean, the best evidence actually shows that it's something that you give it to older animals and it reverses the age-related effects. And honestly, I'm not confident that like for people our age to take it is even good. Like it might down-regulate some of those natural compensatory mechanisms, and like who knows, like you might age faster. I mean, you might not. Who knows?
Yeah.
But
Maybe we should wait till we're actually old, then we
right,
can throw the
exactly.
kitchen
Like
sinks to get us.
like this is like so the reason I think this is interesting is it's because it's really is an age reversing chemical. Like it doesn't like
Yeah.
it it works because older animals have low levels of this, and then you can boost them up to the levels seen in young animals, and you kind of reverse some of the effects of aging.
Yeah. Did they find it through a screen? Were they just like screening, like comparing old and young animals and seeing what was changed?
I
And like
don't
this is
think
one of the things that
so. I
turned
feel it
out?
was.
Yeah. Or they just happened to be
Let
studying
me
this
look up how they found it actually.
like historically? Yeah.
I think this.
Apparently, to increase it naturally, you need to exercise.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things I was saying about how I think exercise really is an anti-aging intervention.
Yeah. Oh, just.
So this is kind of the first paper I believe um, that really kind of that showed this. So declining NAD plus pseudohypoxic induces a pseudohypoxic effect. Um, and so kind of and so it looks like so this group David Sinclair, they're really interested in metabolism and aging, and so I think they were actually kind of seeing so they were studying kind of the role of genes in the mitochondria in aging, and they noticed that kind of like as animals get older kind of the some of these mitochondrial genes their expression starts to change, and they were kind of wondering like why that happens. So they were really kind of looking specifically at um, at these mitochondrial genes, and they found that kind of related to these genes called sirtuins, but it was also related to levels of this chemical called NAD+. And that's
Got
when
it.
they started thinking about this.
That's cool. That's such a like that. That's actually quite fascinating. I am now convinced to exercise some more. I don't know about orally consumption of it because I do think like because we make it naturally, like boosting our natural ability to make it seems like a good idea. And it actually, it makes sense that you need to make it if you're exercising too, because like you're damaging your muscles. You're exercising, therefore you need to like have more repair mechanisms going on. That makes sense. Very good. Cool.
Yeah.
I think
That was
this worked out really well. and with that, we are philosophizing. Thank you for joining us. See you next Thursday. Oh wait, are we doing next Thursday? It's kind of holidays next Thursday. We might
Maybe.
skip
Yeah.
a couple for
Okay.
holidays.
Yeah.
And then we'll be back for sure in the new year.
Yep. All right. Yeah, we'll be back
There you go.
sometime. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.